Welcome. I'm Audra Parker. I'm the president and CEO of the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound, and thanks for joining us tonight at our next webinar. So for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound is a nonprofit group. We're based in Hyannis on Cape Cod, and our mission is the permanent protection and preservation of Nantucket Sound, the body of water that lies between Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. And this is very important because Nantucket Sound is a really unique body of water. First of all, it was dry land thousands of years ago and is a sacred tribal site. It's home to a wide variety of wildlife, many species, and it is one ecosystem that is split between state and federal waters. So if you look at the map that we're showing here, and you go out 3 miles from the shorelines, well, the map that we were showing here, if you go out 3 miles from the shorelines of Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard, those are state waters. There we go, in the light blue. And those are protected under a state law called the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuaries Act. I'm not sure what's happening here. And the waters in the center are federal waters in the dark blue. And the federal waters are still open to development and can be leased by the U.S. Department of the Interior for development, while the state waters are protected under that state law. So the Alliance is seeking designation for all of Nantucket Sound as a National Historic Landmark. So National Historic Landmark is the highest level of historic protection possible. It recognizes the rich tribal and maritime history of Nantucket Sound. And other examples of National Historic Landmarks are the entire island of Nantucket, Wesleyan Grove in Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard, and the Kennedy Compound in Hyannis Port here on Cape Cod. So how are we doing that? The Alliance is seeking National Historic Landmark designation in 2 ways. One, through federal legislation in Congress, and secondly, through an administrative process through the U.S. Department of the Interior. So both of those paths would achieve this protection by designating the sound and recognizing it as a National Historic Landmark. The legislation would do a little bit more in providing some environmental benefits to address other threats facing Nantucket Sound, like diminished water quality and habitat degradation. It would protect traditional uses like fishing and recreation, and also improve the consistency between the protections that exist in the state waters under state law and the void of those in the federal waters in the center. So we've got wide and enthusiastic support for designation of the sound, for protecting the sound. We have built a broad coalition of stakeholders ranging from chambers of commerce, commercial fishing groups, historic preservation groups, municipalities across the Cape and Islands, and many, many others. So to go forward, one of the other things we are doing is having these webinars. We call the series a celebration of Nantucket Sound. We've had over 20 different webinars over the last several years, and we had one in-person session with a variety of speakers, but looking at Nantucket Sound's rich history, some of the species that call Nantucket Sound home, and many other aspects. So tonight, I'm very excited to introduce Don Wilding, and he's going to talk about some of the most famous storms that have hit Cape Cod and Nantucket Sound. Don's a historian and author of 5 books, including Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898, and the upcoming book to be released in May entitled Historic Storms of Cape Cod. Don's worked as a Cape Cod tour guide and is a regular speaker on Cape Cod history across New England. He's an award-winning newspaper editor, writer, and designer. And he's also led history walks for the Harwich Conservation Trust and was recognized as one of their Conservationists of the Year in 2023. So with that, I'd like to welcome Don. Don, you want to turn on your video? Perfect. Oh, and now your audio next.
There we are.
There you are. Well, welcome.
Right?
I can see you and I can hear you. So thank you so much. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, and I will get off, and then after your presentation, I will take questions from the audience, and so I'll pop back on and facilitate a Q&A with you.
Okay, well, let me
Okay,
get this program up and running here, and
okay,
then we'll get it going here.
okay.
And
I'm gonna
this should
pop off.
be hmm, hmm. Well, okay, and uh, all right, that should be. Does that look good to you there?
Looks great.
All right, excellent. Okay, well, again, thank you, Audra. Thank you for having me here tonight to join everybody for this program. Historic Storms of Cape Cod, something I've been focusing on in my work for many years, and now I finally have had the opportunity to turn this into a book and into this presentation. And tonight we're going to take a look at some of these great storms that have happened uh, here on Cape Cod, but also try to focus more on the area around Nantucket Sound. And of course, that happened a lot with the hurricanes. But when it comes to storms on Cape Cod, especially, I think my friend Nan Turner Waldron, the late Nan Turner Waldron, author of the book Journey to Outermost House, she put it really well in these words. She said that every one of us needs to feel beyond self, to feel small measured against distant horizons, to feel powerless against the winds, to feel voiceless against the thunder of the storm. So we're looking at a variety of different storms that hit here, and the historian for the town of Sandwich, Russell Lavelle, put it very well back in 1973. He noted that Cape Cod has some special features. Um, I just hope this is coming through. I was just noticed that my connection is a bit unstable for some reason. Um,
It's working great.
it's working great.
Yep,
Okay.
thank you.
The special features which affect the damage storms can do here. Sustained high winds can push seawater far above high tide levels, especially in the enclosed bays. Buzzards Bay collects high water and hurricane winds from the south. Cape Cod Bay fills up in nor'easters. The shallows east and south of the Cape get very choppy in storms, just as the North Sea does. So I'll start out with nor'easters. Northeasters, nor'easters, or as people in Eastern Mass might like to pronounce it, nor'easters. Um, Cape Cod is right in the path of these really powerful low pressure systems. They tend to develop in the latitudes between Georgia and New Jersey, usually within 100 miles east or west of the East Coast. Then they move northeastward and typically attain maximum intensity near New England or the maritime provinces of Canada. So when a nor'easter comes knocking on the door, like it does here in this picture from 1932 in Chatham, you look at what Henry Beston wrote in The Outermost House from 1928. He wrote, "With the turn of the tide came fury unbelievable. The great rhythm of its waters, now at one with the rhythm of the wind, the ocean rose out of the night to attack the ancient rivalry of earth, hurling breaker after thundering breaker against the long bulwark of sands." So one of the great nor'easters that has ever struck New England occurred back 125 years ago, and that was the Cape Cod. That was the Portland Gale of 1898, which I featured in my book Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898, which came out just last year. The Portland Gale, a lot of people might not know the details about it, or they might think it's associated more with Portland, Maine. It was actually more affiliated with the steamer Portland. But what happened that night, back on November 26th and 27th of 1898, the Boston Sunday Post put it, it was a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. There was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. The Portland was a steamship, one of a couple that ran between Boston and Portland, Maine, back at that time. It was one of the main methods of transportation between the two cities. In fact, if you wanted to do any traveling, the best ways to go would be either with the steamers, the Portland and the Bay State, or you'd have to take the railroad. So during the weekend, Thanksgiving weekend of 1898, the Portland was leaving Boston right around 7 o'clock, and with a full boat. I mean, they're almost this disaster that ended up happening. The Portland was never heard from again after this, and nearly 200 lives, about 192 casualties aboard the Portland. During this storm, 141 vessels were wrecked. 40 of them were from Cape Cod, and 456 lives were lost along the coast from Maine all the way down to New Jersey. And it was particularly intense between Casco Bay and Martha's Vineyard. And this map here was actually something that ran in the newspapers following the storm. The Portland ended up sinking over Stellwagen Bank out in off of Cape Cod, in Cape Cod Bay. And the Portland was actually leaving Boston that night at 7 p.m., knowing a storm was coming. And it headed, as you can see here, it was heading north towards Portland, and then it kind of drifted out into the Atlantic a little bit. And probably because of the winds that became just so bad, this storm attained at hurricane force winds by this time, and it hit very quickly. And I don't think anybody really expected it to be as bad as it turned out. It drifted out and then down towards Provincetown. It ended up sinking about 20 miles north of Provincetown. This shows it. At first, they thought it may have run aground off of Highland Light or the Peaked Hill bars, or just off of Provincetown. But during that particular journey, all these people were lost. 192 people. The captain, Hollis Blanchard, was, he was blamed for it by the Portland Steam Packet Company for taking the ship out, but it turns out he had actually been pressured by his superiors when it came to going out in bad weather. They wanted him to go. So he ended up taking the blame at first, after, it was easy to blame the captain who was already dead, but that's what ended up happening. So with this storm, I went into great detail in it in my previous book, Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898 last year. And there were many other incidents too, all kinds of shipwrecks. And there were several of the lightships too experienced problems, such as the Pollock Rip lightship off of Monomoy, off of Chatham. It actually broke from its anchors and drifted all the way to Delaware before they were able to finally get it under control and bring it back. It took a couple of weeks. That was just one instance. The harbors at both Provincetown and at Vineyard Haven were just complete disasters. The newspapers described the scenes at both of those harbors. Schooners were tossed around like toys by the storm, and countless, a lot of lives lost just in those places. And there was all kinds of damage done in the harbors. Also here you can see along the railroad that ran along the bay side of Sandwich, West Barnstable, and also in North Truro, there was a lot of damage. The railroad tracks were washed out, derailed train travel for several days. Trees were down Cape wide. So it ended up being a pretty bad thing. It was one of those situations where the Portland Gale was one of those storms that was continuously being, that was the that set the bar. And people continued to compare every storm after that for years and years and years. And they would always say, yes, it was back in 1898 when the Portland went down. And it wasn't really until, well, some of you might remember this storm, known as the Blizzard of '78, a huge snow event across a lot of eastern New England in particular. But here on Cape Cod, it was more of a uh, tidal event than it was a snow event. And if anybody was living down here, particularly on the outer Cape, there was more snow on the upper Cape area. There was not a lot of damage on the south-facing beaches compared to what was going on the bay side, and particularly along Cape Cod's outer beach. This was the weather forecast for that storm. For most of New England, they were looking for 8 to 16 inches of snow, 25 to 40-mile-an-hour winds. This is kind of par for the course for nor'easters. And what ended up happening, there was a high tide during a new moon during this storm on February 6, 1978. It was 14 and a half feet above mean low water. That means it was 4 feet above normal. The high winds were officially clocked at 92 miles an hour. Unofficial readings had it at 120 miles an hour in Chatham. The Coast Guard beach bathhouse in Eastham and the parking lot were completely destroyed, and a 50-foot long concrete septic tank was unearthed near the bathhouse there. And this was the scene from the Coast Guard station at Coast Guard Beach in Eastham. If you look down that barrier beach southward, this is what you would have seen. Just the water just completely overran the entire barrier beach and into Nauset Marsh, and it completely changed everything about that beach forever afterwards. This is a scene from the air of one of the beach camps that was surrounded by the water and eventually taken away by it. It was known as Conrad Noble's Butterfly House, and that was one of the many structures that were swept away during this storm. That's the same house after the storm had passed, sitting in what was left of it in Nauset Marsh. Another victim of that was Henry Beston's house, known as, he called it the forecastle. It was his base of operations in his book, The Outermost House. This 20 by 16 cottage was also swept away, never to be seen again. It was originally built in 1928. This was a before and after scene of the Outermost House on the beach in Eastham. At the top part of it, you can kind of see the house in the dunes, and then all of a sudden at the bottom there's nothing but flat, a flat sandbar with just a few of the posts remaining. That's how much damage this entire storm had done. And this is a scene with the bathhouse at Coast Guard Beach. That no longer stands either. This took a real beating. They ended up having to burn it down, what was left of it, afterwards. And it was just quite a scene there during that storm, because the storm had developed an eye, and that eye had passed over Cape Cod, particularly over Eastham. The Portland Gale had also developed an eye. Even though these were winter storms, they had developed the eye that you would see in a hurricane. Well, in the case of when that came by, a lot of people were able to come out to the beach, and they saw this scene going on at Coast Guard Beach, and it was just a marvel to behold. And Robert Finch, the well-known Cape Cod nature essay writer, told me about 10 years ago, he said there were hundreds of people there watching the waves smash up against the bathhouse. And he said with every wave, the crowds would just cheer. And he said, why is that? What are we cheering about? He said, that's stuck in my mind from that scene. And this was another particularly interesting situation during that storm. If anybody had ever been to Coast Guard Beach before this storm, you could go. There was not only that bathhouse, there was quite a bit more dune land and beach and a huge parking lot down in front of the Coast Guard station. And during that storm, the night before on the 6th, it was very dark. Mostly it had turned to rain at this point. And a Volkswagen had came driving down into the parking lot. They wanted to go watch the storm and during, how it would with the waves and everything. And as they pulled into the parking lot, they didn't realize that the waves were starting to break behind them. So as the Volkswagen is going into the parking lot, the waves suddenly come underneath the car, lift it up, and carries it into the marsh in back of the beach. So these young people are in this car, terrified that this is it. We're gonna die, and they're floating around, being tossed around. And then they looked up, and behind the Coast Guard station, they could see a car with its lights on, and that was a lifesaver to them, because they were able from there to get out of their car, get through the water, and climb up that hill. And they felt if they didn't see that, they might very well have perished. And you can see in these photos here, particularly the top one where the water is coming in there. And that car sat there for a couple of days, and they finally were able to get a tow truck down there a couple of days later when the water had subsided. And they pulled it up out of the water and started working on it, changed the fluids, and put the key in the ignition, and voila, the car started. And it was really amazing, considering this is salt water. So if you're dealing with salt water, the chances of your car starting again aren't very good. So Volkswagen should have been there to make a commercial after that particular type of incident. This was the scene in Provincetown, along the bay side, right near the Lobster Pot restaurant. You could see all the debris that was brought in. The streets of Provincetown, Commercial Street, was under a few feet of water, as it was during the Portland Gale. And Monomoy Island, just to the south of Chatham, had split into 3 pieces. Huge waves had broken through these 30-foot dunes at Boston Beach and Truro. That was the first storm to flood the Pamet River there. So going from the blizzard of 78, this is another one that really horrified a lot of people. It depends on what you want to call it. Most of us know it as the perfect storm. At first it was known as the No Name Storm or the Halloween Storm of October 1991. And it was described later by NOAA and the National Weather Service as they finally said they were calling it the Halloween Storm. But the public really called it the perfect storm after a while. And they said, although the National Hurricane Center considered classifying this as a hurricane, the National Meteorological Center, the National Hurricane Center, and the Weather Service decided against that, to avoid unnecessarily confusing and alarming the public. Because yes, there was a hurricane involved with this storm. There was a combination of several weather factors. The fading Hurricane Grace coming up from the south was one of the factors. That was absorbed by a developing low pressure area that was forming along a cold front that was barreling in from the west. So that created this meteorological bomb that and you can see on this map here where it begins off of the coast of Newfoundland. And over a period of several days, it cut out, then back towards Cape Cod, and you can see it's just south of Nantucket Sound here. And then it spins around in the ocean a little bit, and then turns right back up north and finally goes ashore up in Canada. And this had meteorologists totally baffled for several days. it ended up being called the Perfect Storm because of that title. It was a conversation between the author, Sebastian Younger, who happens to be a summer resident of Truro, and Robert Case from the National Weather Service in Boston. And they came up with the name The Perfect Storm because of the factors. There were wind gusts of 78 miles an hour on Morris Island off Chatham, and 79 miles an hour up in Provincetown at McMillan Pier. The weather buoy off of Nova Scotia reported a wave exceeding 100 feet. And east of the Cape, there were wave heights measured at 39 feet. So you can see that with the wave exceeding 100 feet. And if you ever saw the movie The Perfect Storm, they actually show the boat the Andrea Gale trying to get up over the wave, and that was easily made to look like it was supposed to be about 100 feet high. Meanwhile, here on the Cape, you looked at some of these situations with the Chatham beach camps, and particularly the Edson family, who had Bruce and Donna Edson had been staying there for many years, the second village of North Beach in Chatham. And the days leading up to Halloween in 1991, they just knew something wasn't quite right here, and they ended up getting marooned because of the weather conditions. Several neighbors and friends, they staged what was called a heroic rescue by way of ORVs and taken ashore that way. They really had to, Rob Angel, he described it as the ride off the beach being pedal to the metal. Your foot is stuck right to the floor, transmission's heating up. The sand is nothing but soup and you're sinking in. So if you stop, you're going to get stuck. The adrenaline is pumping. And that's the type of the situation they were up against. They were afraid they weren't going to make it getting off, but somehow they did. And up in Provincetown, the dune shacks got hit particularly hard. Mildred Champlin was telling about her experience during that storm, and her family's had a dune shack up there for many, many years. They'd gone through, she'd said they'd gone through 5 days of that storm, 10 high moon tides. And they looked down when they got there, and rather than out over the 100 feet of grass they had a week ago, the storm had clawed away about 75 feet of footage, and the ocean lapping almost at their feet. And the dune to the east was demolished, holes all over the place. Waste pipe that had been under the sand was exposed, easier to duck under it than climb over it. So that was just a few of the examples of what happened during the storm known as the Perfect Storm. There were also the rescues that were documented in the film The Perfect Storm out at sea. And but as I mentioned, that was also a hurricane, and at least part of it was a hurricane. And so I'll go a little bit now into the hurricanes that came up this way. And believe me, we've had some really, really destructive storms that had their origins in the tropics. The name hurricane, it actually comes from the Mayan god Hurricán. And that was he was described as being a god who sent his thunderbolts and ferocious windstorms upon the people and blew the seas into raging fury that swept all creatures before him into death and destruction. And Cape mariners would later come face to face with his towering anger and developed a healthy respect for it. So when I wrapping up the research on historic storms of Cape Cod a year ago, I paid a visit to Glenn Field. He was the warning coordination meteorologist for the National Weather Service's Boston area office in Norton. And Glenn took me aside. I sat there with him for a couple of hours, and we talked about a lot of things. And he was telling me about all the different hurricanes that come this way, and they originate in one of two places. Either the Cape Verde Islands or the Bahamas in that area. And he said the Cape Verde systems are pretty big storms. They usually take a week to cross the Atlantic. And the Bahama storms, they tend to be somewhat smaller. They accelerate up the coast, but they don't give you a heck of a lot of lead time. And he said one thing to remember, a rule of thumb, a storm has to be at 72 degrees west longitude if it's going to have a chance of hitting us here in southeastern New England. And he said the point when New England needs to take action is when there's a named storm in the Bahamas. If it's off the North Carolina coast, you're late. He said you're already feeling the impacts of the storm. And one storm, though, that they had no idea was coming, because at the time they really didn't know, the forecasting wasn't at that level yet, was the 1938 hurricane. It was probably the deadliest hurricane to ever hit New England. There were, of course, the storms back in 1635, which was one pretty bad storm. But this one, it just the overall destruction it caused. It killed over 600 people along the East Coast. Around the Cape, it killed about 16 or 17 people on the Upper Cape area. The storm, and this is before they started giving names to storms. They didn't start doing that until 1953. The 1938 hurricane has been known as either the Long Island Express or the Great New England Hurricane, because it came ashore first over Long Island and then over Milford, Connecticut, and then just raced up through New England. And it was moving northward at about 60 miles an hour, which is just extraordinary forward speed for any kind of a storm, but for this hurricane and the power that it was packing. When it made landfall, still moving at 51 miles an hour. And Blue Hill Observatory outside of Boston in Milton, they recorded sustained winds at 121 miles an hour and gusts of 186 miles an hour. And there were storm surges of 18 to 25 feet in Buzzards Bay. Now, think about that for a minute, what that could do now. There was 20 feet of water in downtown Providence and 8 feet of water in the streets of Falmouth, particularly in Woods Hole. So now imagine if something like that strikes today, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But here's what happened afterwards. The destruction was just unbelievable. And one of the newspaper editors in Wareham described it. He said, then came the dawn. He says, words cannot describe it. To the writer whose own newspaper plant had been under 6 feet of water, the thought came to him, as it must have to all who sustained like losses, that the blow was too great to realize. Where to begin and what to do? Nobody knew, but everybody began to do something, few dollars it might seem. In Falmouth, there was a woman who drowned after her car ran out of gas on Beach Road near the Moore Pavilion. She was out with her nephew. They were running some errands, and they knew bad weather was coming, but they had no idea what. And as they were finishing their errands, they noticed that the gas was running low, and the woman said, "Oh, no, go, let's go. We can make it home." Well, they didn't. They ran out of gas. The nephew got out, and the woman decided she was going to stay there and watch this storm. Well, she had no idea what she was in for, because he left to go get gas, and as she's sitting in the car, next thing you know, he came back. She was nowhere to be found. And later on, he found out that she had tried to venture out of the car, and the waves just coming over. She disappeared after a while, and they found her body after the storm. There was another Silver Beach couple who fled to the roof of their house, only to have the floodwaters rip the roof off and then carried it away. And this couple eventually perished when that roof, which was being carried away by the water, crashed into another house. So that's just an example of some of the things that happened in that area. there was another group of people. 5 residents were in a Gray Gables cottage in Bourne and lost their lives when the cottage dropped into Buzzards Bay after it was flooded out, and it swept it into the Cape Cod Canal, and then it finally came to rest against the north side of the Bourne Bridge. You can see it there towards the bottom left-hand corner of that picture. And the victims were later removed from a hole in the cottage's roof. And they said I'm convinced that the water rose here because it was caught in a bottleneck, no place else to go. And 1944, this one arrived 3 hours after high tide, another Category 3 hurricane. The Vineyard Lightship went to the bottom during this great Atlantic hurricane. 12 men perished. And they were ordered to remain at their station by their superiors. And they had to ride out the storm. And then there's 105-mile-an-hour winds. Flares were spotted, but to no avail. They were not able to do anything, and they were swept away. The lightship's bell is now on display at the New Bedford waterfront. West Dennis got hit particularly hard. Lower County Road was under 8 feet of water. Worst damage ever at the Lighthouse Inn in West Dennis. This new dining room that had been built 3 months earlier was destroyed, washed into Weir Creek on the other side of the road. 27 cottages east of the inn were destroyed. And in Chatham, boats were swept from the Stage Harbor shore, piled up on Turns Island. Alton Kenny's Marine Railway building collapsed. 2 wharves were swept away. Winds blew the steeple off the Chatham Universalist Church. Morris Island Bridge completely washed out. You can see that picture is on the right-hand side there. And even German POWs from Camp Edwards were used to help clean up the downed trees. They brought in 4 sawmills of the U.S. Army to turn trees into lumber. And the last century had 4 significant hurricanes, all came within a 16-year period. Carol and Edna came within 12 days of each other in 1954. Carol was a twin to the 1938 hurricane, Category 3. This was August 31st. Came in at high tide, forward speed of 40 miles an hour, 14-foot storm surge, winds of 80 to 100 miles an hour, high tide almost 11 feet on the high water on the Foundless Shore of Buzzards Bay. And this was just a quick story. I'll run it by. Is a man got a call from this woman, Martha Winnick. John McLaughlin was his name. She wanted his daughter to babysit, and all he said was, "Get out of the house." He knew what was going to happen. She had no idea what was coming, and it turns out she and her daughter and her sister all died during the storm when the water came in and just smashed the house to pieces. And this storm also took a toll on another floating lighthouse. The Nantucket lighthouse lightship was smashed, its rudder gone, and the bridge almost demolished, thrown around by this storm. But somehow they could not, these men on board couldn't even abandon ship, all 12 of them, but somehow they survived. And not even 2 weeks later, on September 12th, Hurricane Edna hits. And Hurricane Edna was, when it passed over the Cape and out to sea, the winds began to turn northwest. So the actual storm surges from Edna were at their worst in Cape Cod Bay. They actually started piling up there and into Wellfleet Harbor. And that was one of the really unusual things. There were a lot of areas too along the south coast that got hit hard there, particularly in Osterville and also in Dennis. They also felt pretty hard again. Hurricane Bob, yet another storm that did a lot of damage. Wind gusts of 125 miles an hour in other parts of the Cape, 100 miles an hour in Chatham. and storm surges of 12 to 15 feet in the Buzzards Bay area. This shows some of the damage that was done up in Truro and Provincetown. This is actually the Sandcastle Resort in Provincetown on the Truro line that blew the roof off. This is in Orleans. You can see this is the windmill there in Orleans. Had the Jonathan Young windmill had lost 2 of its blades, and this was another building over on Nantucket Road that lost a lot of its siding. And this was some of the flooding damage at the Lighthouse Inn in West Dennis. So it was that did quite a bit of damage there as well. So that was just I just gave you what was pretty much a very brief rundown of some of the things I'm focusing on in this book. I'm also focusing on the 1987 storm that busted through in Chatham at the Chatham Bar, and also several other storms too that in the 20th century and in the 21st century. But looking back on these storms, that picture there was from the blizzard of '78 as well. That's the this is at the what they call Collins Landing. It's if you're coming from the Rotary on the Eastham Orleans line and you're going up into Eastham and you look out towards Town Cove, this is down there along with a cottage colony that the Collins family owns. And years ago, after these early 1990s storms, Ken Collins, who was a selectman in Eastham for many years, he would mark the level storms would flood that structure there along the Town Cove, the way a lot of people measure the growth of their children. So you can see there the '78 storm is actually way down on the bottom. The storm of '87 is waist high, and they said the marks of 1991, referring to the perfect storm, need no ink. They cover the garage. That's the highest mark there. So these were all these little indications of where the storm came in. Very similar to at Crosby's Boatyard in Osterville, I believe it is, where they marked the flooding caused by some of the hurricanes of the past. So I have to ask the question, is the worst still yet to come? Yeah, more than likely. Glenn Field said the worst case scenario is a storm with the potency of the 1938 hurricane moving over New England once again. He said it's not a question of if, it's a question of when it will happen. He said, in this case, a northern movement of the storm that makes landfall near Foxwoods in Connecticut would have a 20-foot surge in Narragansett Bay. He said, if you bring the storm up Narragansett Bay, the water has nowhere to go in Buzzards Bay. That's kind of what happened during the '38 hurricane. He said there would be 30 feet at Parkwood Beach in Wareham. And you could also adjust that accordingly because, and he said also Hurricane Katrina's maximum storm surge was 25 feet, the one that hit New Orleans. But if you're on the right hand, if you're east of the eye of the hurricane, that is where the worst winds are. So you're also going to get probably some of the highest tides, particularly if it happens at high tide, and if you have a really high tide due to the cycles of the moon or whatever. And either way, there's not much you can do. You can try as you might to stop what the storms are going to throw at you. But as Mildred Champlin put it, she said after the 1991 storm, she said, we viewed the devastation, and I said, I never look forward to predicting the future. All I know is that Mother Nature is in charge, and we have been grateful for all the years we've had and enjoy right now. So far, we've been lucky. Another perfect storm will come in the future. We know that. And after Hurricane Bob, the Orleans Senior Center received a call from the Cape Codder asking about well, how did the seniors make out during the storm? And the director there said, she said, the seniors didn't have any problems. They all know what to do. It's young people like us who have to figure things out. He said, we think we live in such a sophisticated world, but nature humbles us. So I would like to thank everybody for you all having me here tonight through your computers. And I got a lot of events coming up on the Cape this summer, and especially to promote historic storms of Cape Cod. I'll be leading a few walks at the Cape Cod National Seashore through the Harwich Conservation Trust. Also be giving a lot of talks and a couple of book signings as well. These will start in June and run in through August and even into September. So there's also, you can find everything. It'll be updated frequently at my website, dwcapecod.com/events. And you can keep track of all the everything that's going on there. The book is coming out May 20th, and Historic Storms of Cape Cod. You can pre-order that now at dwcapecod.com. There's a link to do that. You can also get it through any of your other online book outlets if you care to do that. It's available for pre-order now. So you can look for that on May 20th, and I'll be out and about on the Cape. So I'll turn it back over to you, Audra, and
Okay.
the rest of well,
Great. Well, that was great. I enjoyed
very much.
hearing what you had to say, and I have some questions from the audience.
I'll bet. Okay.
Okay, so one of our audience members asks, what is the most impressive storm that you can remember personally on the Cape? For us, it was the tornado in 2019.
Yeah, I'll be covering that in the book too. I unfortunately was not on the Cape that day. Or maybe fortunately I wasn't on the Cape. But it's for me on the Cape, I remember being on the Cape. I've been there since, more or less since the beginning of the millennium. So it's there was the 2005 blizzard was the most snow I had ever seen in one shot, almost 3 feet of snow. But I would have to say the most unusual one, especially what came later that year, December 9th, 2005. And a lot of people ended up saying, what the heck was that thing? That storm that hit. And a lot of people now might not know what I'm talking about, but it was a storm that kind of came out of nowhere. There was a nor'easter that had hit the area, and things were actually clearing up late in the day. And then all of a sudden, it just turned into like a hurricane. It was the Weather Service refers to it as the sting jet storm. And it was just this combination of factors on how the millibars dropped so quickly. It was it made, you've heard the term bombogenesis probably.
Yep.
Well, this is even faster than bombogenesis of what happens during this. I forget what the numbers were off the top of my head, but it was just phenomenal as to what happened. And you could hear this deep howling wind outside. The winds kicked up to about 100 miles an hour. There were trees downed in Orleans and Brewster and many other places. You couldn't get out of Orleans after that storm. There were dozens of dolphins that were washed ashore in the bay on the bayside beaches, particularly Dennis and Brewster and Eastham, around that area. So it was just, and the power was out for a very long time
As it
afterwards.
usually is, yeah.
So it really was, that was just one of the most incredible weather events I had ever seen, not just on Cape Cod, but anywhere. So that's one I can throw out there.
Okay, another question. Ted is asking, did any of these storms change the opening to Nantucket Sound near Monomoy Shoals?
Monomoy itself was affected quite a bit by the blizzard of '78, and it's always it broke. I think I mentioned it. It did break it at one point there. So yeah, with each one of these storms, off the top of my head, I don't have those numbers either, but or those years. But yes, it did affect Monomoy's structure quite a bit. It rearranges the sands all the time.
Hey, Joel is asking, are tornadoes now the next big worry, like the one recently?
It sure seems that way, doesn't it?
It does.
Over the last couple of years. Uh, I think just with what's happened in recent years, and not only on Cape Cod, you're seeing them in other places in New England too, where you get last summer. I have a place. I live up in Franklin, and also I have a place on the Cape as well. And in Franklin, it seemed like we were getting tornado warnings every other week. It seemed during this past summer. And during the last few years on the Cape, we seem to have gotten quite a few more.
Yeah.
So the weather certainly seems to have gotten a lot crazier over the last few years. And whenever things get unstable, that increases the chances of tornadoes getting worse. So yeah, I think it could happen. Sure.
John has a comment, not a question. He said that December 9th storm wiped out hundreds of trees in Nickerson Park. It was
Yep.
the weirdest storm I've seen.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to agree with that. You can also see hundreds of trees down if you're driving on Nauset Road and Doane Road, particular in Eastham, going down to Coast Guard Beach in the Cape Cod National Seashore area, just past Doane Rock. If you look in the woods, you still see all these trees that are down that came down during that storm, and they're not blocking paths or anything, but you can definitely see something went through there.
Yeah, the
At some point.
destruction.
Yeah, the destruction of the trees is still phenomenal.
Peter's asking, are there any lessons learned from past storms that have influenced current coastal management and infrastructure planning on Cape Cod?
Yeah, it seems that's a subject that comes up every year when it comes to uh, taking care of things after the storm comes and trying to manage these storms. You saw Nauset Light, for example, the beach there. You get for many years you had that big stairway that went down to the beach from the top of the cliff there. Well, every year, starting in around 2009, 2010, it seemed, every winter or every other winter, that was getting washed out. They had to build a new stairway. It was happening at Marconi also. And finally, they gave up, and there's an area just 40 or 50 yards to the south of that where that stairway was, and the Nauset Light parking lot. They built a path down through the dunes. The cliff kind of drops down there, so they enabled a path to go right out to the beach that winds down through the woods and the dunes there. Well, I went down there during the storm of March 2018, and the waves just came pouring into the dunes in that area where they had cut through with the path. So either way, either what you do one thing or another, you're still up against the you can't fight Mother Nature here.
Nope.
That's one example.
Yeah. David has a comment. The worst storms for me were Hurricane Bob in 91, and then just 2 months later, the perfect storm.
Yeah.
Margaret, people are reminiscing here about their storm experiences. Margaret says, I was a little girl during Hurricane Carol. The next morning, only a chimney remained from a small beach house in Katuitt Harbor. I asked my mom where the house had gone, and she said, out there. There wasn't even a stick of wood. It left a lasting impression on me.
I got a lot of stories in the book about especially during Carol or any of those storms, 38, 44, and Carol and Edna, where all those places from Falmouth all the way to Dennis were just, and even into Harwich and Chatham, just houses disappeared, floated away or floated from one side to another.
Yeah.
That happened with a few instances as well. So
It is
Um,
amazing the power of Mother Nature.
it really is. It's scary.
Kevin asks, do you think the hurricane category doesn't matter as much as where projected to hit landfall? I don't think I've ever seen the eye hit us. It seems like they mostly go offshore.
Yeah, you don't want to be on the east side of the eye. That's where you don't want to be. It's you kind of there's a whole formula that Glenn Field explained to me, and I wish I had it in front of me, but it is in the book. It explains what happens. You know, don't be so concerned about landfall, but if it is, you actually add more to the wind speed that they're saying. If you're on the east side of the eye,
Okay.
and on the west side of the eye, that's where the rain is going to be. The worst of the rain is going to be. So it's very erratic, and it kind of always wobbles around sometimes. And you can't really. You just got to be prepared for the worst. That's the best. That's the thing
Best
you
advice.
best advice. Yeah.
Margaret says, why are people allowed to rebuild in flood zones? People have short memories of how high the water comes up and the destruction that happens.
Good question.
Yep, that is a good question.
I don't quite get it. You're It was once said after Henry Beston's Outermost House went out to sea, building right along the water is like playing Russian roulette with the sea. Um, it's Yeah, it has happened quite a bit, and there was so much destruction along Buzzards Bay during and Nantucket Sound as well after those earlier hurricanes, especially 1938 and 44 and 54. And after that, they've rebuilt and then some all along those areas. Now, Glenn Field is saying that storm's coming up, it's going to happen. Now, imagine if we get a 1938 storm at high tide uh, coming in again. With all this stuff that's built up, the damage would be astronomical.
Yeah, it
It
really would.
Unbelievable, way more than it was before because of all the building that's gone on. That's something that people should think about.
Very good point. Yes. And last comment, not a question. Woody says, enjoy this presentation a great deal. My wife and I have become a bit geeky about the hurricane of 1938. Several really good books about that storm.
Yeah. Oh, that was a doozy. I mean, I did get the opportunity to meet some people over the years that had experienced it. They were quite young at the time. They were only kids, but boy, they recall it like it was the most devastating thing that ever happened. And when you look at uh, how badly that 38 hurricane hit the Upper Cape, well, it did even more to the coast of Connecticut and to Rhode Island, 20 feet of water in downtown Providence. That just shows you what
Yeah.
it was capable of doing. So it's yeah, good observation.
So that's it for questions. I learned a lot, and I will be careful to stay away from the east side of an eye in a
But
storm
if you
going
can, yeah,
forward.
yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us, and it was a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to
Yes,
be here.
great. So thank you all for joining us. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, or if you have questions for Don, I'm sure I can help you track him down. Our next webinar is going to be on May 16th, and it is with Paul Nizwicki. He's the CEO at the Cape Cod Chamber, and he's going to be talking about the economy and tourism on the Cape and Islands and how Nantucket Sound fits into that. We're also pleased to announce that we're partnering with the Cape Cod Maritime Museum for a couple of beach cleanups here on Nantucket Sound, one on April 13th at Veterans Beach in Hyannis, and another on Calmus Beach on April 27th. So I hope you can join us at either the beach cleanups or our next webinars. Please stay in touch. You can reach me at audra@saveoursound.org. And I hope you will help us by contacting your legislators and letting them know how important it is to protect Nantucket Sound. by donating, or if you belong to a group or an organization that is interested in hearing more about our mission to protect Nantucket Sound, I'm always happy to speak at events. So thanks again, and we will see you hopefully at the next webinar. All right. Good night. Thanks, Dawn.
All right. Thanks very much.
Bye.